Our backward corner of the world was the unquestioned definition of oppression. The moral society and authorities expected nothing less than absolute perfection from the townspeople. The heavy chains our citizens had wrapped around their necks were an immense burden and tool of shame. They weigh down a person's pride and self-confidence to force them into a total state of humility. It was supposed to be an unwavering reminder of past sin and failures. Regardless, I felt most sorry for Matilda, at least in the beginning. She wore more sin chains than anyone else, and yet I admired her immensely. The sheer volume of her shackles would have made the average person's knees buckle under the weight. By their unflinching estimation, she was an unforgivable sinner. Her slender frame should have slumped over in total submission to the sin chains, but she soldiered on. In spite of it all, she maintained an erect posture. My own burden was modest in comparison, and I felt determined to stand upright, in solidarity and defiance to their ugly judgment. Naturally, the enforcers didn't like any resistance from their subjects. They demand absolute compliance, and anyone who didn't bow to their will and morality was branded an agitator. Matilda obviously didn't care for their fascist rules. Even if the extra level of punishment hurled upon her was more than she could mentally take, she acted as if it was nothing. That really infuriated them. All their focus was aimed on her unyielding defiance. The authorities sought to make her an example. She ultimately rebuffed those futile attempts too. Matilda became an icon and martyr for the resistance. The authorities didn't want that. Others recognized her proverbial middle finger to the establishment, and they rallied behind her. No matter how many chains there were weighing her down, the underlying message was clear. She wasn't going to be held back by judgment or oppression. The Bureau of Moral Superiority had an emergency meeting to discuss her continued obstinance. If they couldn't break her will outright, they sought to turn her ardent supporters against her. That failed too. Despite her considerable burdens, she remained tall and steadfast. Matilda was unbreakable, and her supporters saw through the smear campaign. The bureau chiefs were furious. Every tactic was met with failure. Matilda's supporters were growing both in number and vocal support. The general public took notice. Even those who previously feared the unchecked power of the Moral Bureau began to lose fear of them. The public held up their own chains. They walked proudly. They refused to let the symbol of shame define them anymore. Matilda's efforts to thwart the oppression had been successful. It no longer mattered what they did to her any longer. The revolution had begun. The citizens of our society cast off the chains in willful defiance. And once that fear fell away, so did blind obedience to them. In an act of pure symbolism, the members of the Bureau of Moral Superiority were themselves placed in heavy chains of shame. Their shackles were involuntary and locked. A new, democratic consortium arose out of the smoldering ashes of the previous regime. They outlawed the process of symbolic shaming the public for their minor moral failings. More reasonable laws were passed, and much better punishments were established, with rehabilitation as the ultimate aim. At last, the people had a fair government to represent them. Matilda's rusty chains were immortalized in the town square as evidence of the indomitable state of the human spirit. All it took was one brave person to stand up against unjust oppression and resist. From their bravery, the masses followed.